For our second big crypto interview of the hour, is Bitcoin now sitting above $85,000. We are joined by Coinbase CEO Brian Armstrong. Shares of his company have rallied more than 60% since last week's election. This morning, he's announcing the launch of Coinbase 50 Index, which represents the top 50 digital assets listed on the Coinbase exchange. Good morning to you, Brian. It's great to have you in the broadcast. There's about 100 things I want to ask you, but let's just start with what's happening in crypto post this election. And maybe it's the same question I asked of Vlad earlier. As you sort of look out on the horizon now, given President-elect Trump and his administration and his ambitions and plans, what is it that you see happening exactly?
Yeah, well, good to see you, Andrew. I mean, one of the most exciting things about this new Congress, which is the most pro-crypto Congress ever, is that I think we finally have a chance to get some regulatory clarity in the U.S. about some of these big open issues that, you know, frankly, under Gary Gensler, we just haven't gotten any clarity for a long time. So which of these assets are commodities, which of them are securities? That requires the SEC and the CFTC to come together and collaborate on rulemaking, or to have Congress really step in and pass new legislation. So there's an opportunity to do that. The FIT 21 bill, which passed with strong bipartisan support in the House earlier this year, it's now making its way through the Senate, and with any luck, we'll get that passed through the Senate and make it to the president's desk here, either in the lame duck or early in the Trump administration.
Brian, we've obviously seen Bitcoin move materially, obviously, in the past week, really, even more so, even before that, given sort of the run-up and maybe expectation that President Trump was going to win this election. When you think, though, about the other currencies, I mean, they're the ones, I would imagine, at this point that have the bigger room to move, or no?
Well, you know, I think Bitcoin will be the most important crypto asset for a long time. It's got a lot of runway to move as well. But what's exciting about this Coin 50 index that we launched is that people are increasingly becoming aware that it's not just about Bitcoin. There are dozens, hundreds of different assets in crypto that are now, they've met our listing standards, they've made it onto our exchange. And actually, there's thousands of these being created every day, believe it or not. And so some of these they're coins like Ton and WorldCoin, which are being used in emerging markets. There's things like in the DeFi space, like Uniswap, that people want exposure to, or the things that are layer 2 solutions are being built on top of, like Optimism. And I think we're eventually going to get to a world where there's millions of these tokens. You know, every project, every individual, every meme on the internet is going to have one of these. And of course, every company, when they want to raise money, as we get regulatory clarity around securities and have a clear path for that, they should be issuing these coins as well. And so increasingly, people are going to want broad market exposure to crypto. It's going to be the next version of the stock market, but it's also the next version of the internet. And so that's why it's so important for us to have launched this canonical market index, Coin 50, for people who want exposure to the broad market of crypto, not just one asset.
And you're now talking about some of these tokens being used for example, IPOs, something that was sort of taken off the table during even the Jay Clayton era when people started to think about using them that way. I mean, that would upend so much of the financial industry, no?
Well, I think it's important that, you know, crypto is really just a technology to update the financial system writ large. And one of the areas in the financial system that could be improved dramatically, I think, is capital formation. There's lots of different people. They're trying to build an apartment complex. They're trying to start their next tech startup. You know, they want to raise money from investors. And today there's instances where people are trying to raise money for their real estate project, whatever, and they're paying 11% in financing fees to various organizations to package that together. And so that's just one more area on a long list that crypto could update the financial system. Now, those are going to be securities, right? So we need to have a clear path for people to register crypto securities. There's disclosures to figure out. There's, you know, how do you make sure that these are accredited investors when they need that? And so we, along with the rest of the crypto industry, are working on ways to do that. For the last 4 years, we've been, really the door's just been shut in our face. Any kind of productive conversation about how to make that happen in a trusted and compliant way, they've just been totally unwilling to engage in that conversation. And so it's really the dawn of a new crypto era with this election that just happened, because it's the most pro-crypto Congress ever. We had 268 pro-crypto candidates elected to the House. All 9 new senators that got elected had either an A or a B rating on standwithcrypto.org. And of course, in the White House with President Trump, there's a full-throated endorsement of crypto. And so we couldn't be in a better position to finally get some clarity and start to rebuild the crypto industry in America again.
Brian, I'm curious about what you think of this. There is a perception, I think probably real, that the crypto industry had a huge influence on this election, not just the presidential election, but elections around the country when it comes to Congress and the like. There was huge amounts of money that was spent by members of the crypto community, including yourself. And there's a question about money in politics and whether that influence is a good thing. How do you think about it?
Yeah, so I think there's no question there was a lot of money involved from the crypto industry, and there was also a lot of voters who came together in a grassroots movement. So, we don't set the rules of the game, but that's how the game is played in the United States. And I think it was important for us to show up, defend our customers' rights. But they also showed up as a huge voting bloc. And it's important for the crypto industry to have gotten organized. We helped this by funding groups like standwithcrypto.org, which got to almost 2 million advocates in the United States who raised their hand and said they wanted to elect pro-crypto candidates. We're going to continue to support them after the election. They've taken a stretch goal and said they want to get to 4 million advocates in the U.S. by the 2026 midterms. Even Fairshake, the super PAC that we donated to, they've raised an additional almost 50 million of capital right just since the election, looking forward to the midterms. So, I think it's really important we keep showing up as a crypto industry on these policy issues. It's important for the future of America. And look, in my personal judgment, I would prefer that the government was smaller and there was less ability for people to go in there and influence it. But because we have this big government and that's how the rules have been set, both money and the grassroots movement of voters coming together are super important.
What do you think about Donald Trump's World Liberty Financial crypto project?
I haven't looked into it too deeply, to be honest. I'm glad everybody's interested in crypto. That's great, but I don't have too much to say on that particular one, having not looked at it.
We're going to have to run, but I got to ask, Elon Musk saying that he thinks the Fed needs to maybe come under Trump or the White House or have less independence. Do you agree or disagree?
I don't have too strong an opinion on that, but I will say that there's a massive issue in the United States with the deficit, with inflation. And I do think that Bitcoin is a check and balance on irresponsible deficit spending. And to really extend the American experiment for a couple hundred more years, it's important that we don't devalue the dollar, lose the reserve currency status. And that's a big reason why people are buying Bitcoin now.